I'm at Harkness State Park with some of the coolest portrait photography gear in the world. A Sony a7R V with 60 megapixels, a Hasselblad X2D 100C with 100 megapixels, and the amazing Sony a9 Mark III with its global shutter that can sync a flash up to 1/80,000th of a second. I'm going to show you the importance of using high sync speed cameras and what they can do, because this is such a classic portrait photographer problem. You're asked to do a photo shoot in a beautiful spot during sunset, which sounds fantastic, except your subject ends up so backlit that the pictures are terrible. What? I'll take a picture without flash first, just so you can see. Without flash, there is no Chelsea. She has just a silhouette, but that's why as portrait photographers, we control the light. Here I have my flash point trigger turned on. That allows me to wirelessly control the strobe here. My flash is incredible. It's the Flashpoint AD600 Pro. We use it in the studio, out of the studio. All of our strobes are Flashpoint, and we get them from Adorama, who's sponsoring this. They're making this possible, pulling together like $30,000 in gear so that I can teach you a little bit about flash sync. Anytime you're buying gear, head to our link. That lets Adorama know that you support us, and that helps these videos keep coming. Choose Adorama because they have fantastic customer support, quick shipping, but also because they throw in free stuff when you buy things, like light stands or filters. And also they give you VIP points that you can spend on future purchases. Thanks for sponsoring us, Adorama. Now let's turn on this flash and actually take some pictures. I am going to raise the f-stop temporarily on this, just so I can get the lighting under control and I can show you how flash sync works. So I'm gonna start, you what?
Don't look, but I think they're driving over here.
That weird Hyundai? I'll keep an eye on them. For the sake of the first demonstration, I'm going to start at f16 to get the light under control. I'm at 1/30th of a second and the base ISO 100. My first shot at 1/30th of a second is too bright, but I can control that by increasing the shutter speed, going up to 1/60th, 1/25th, 1/250th of a second, and each time I do, the background gets darker. But notice the light on Chelsea stays the same. I did not adjust the output of the flash. It stayed the same. That's because the entire pulse of light is being fired while the shutter is open. Here's VoiceOver Tony to talk more about how that works. VoiceOver Tony, so we can get out of the cold. When you take a flash photo with a proper flash sync, the camera completely opens its shutter, exposing the center to light. Then the camera signals for the flash to pop. The bulb lights up for some period of time, anywhere from 1/200th to 1/80,000th of a second. Then the shutter closes. The light output from the flash is the same, no matter how long the shutter is open. Thus, the light on Chelsea stays the same. However, the sensor keeps gathering ambient light the entire time the shutter is open. That's why shorter shutter speeds make the background darker, but shutter speed does not change the brightness of the foreground that's lit by the flash. But here's the thing, I did all that for the sake of demonstration at f16, but portraits are usually shot pretty wide open. So I'm going to drop down to f2 and just try to repeat the same process. You can see at those same shutter speeds, everything is wildly overexposed. So I clearly need to use a faster shutter speed, but when I try to go beyond 1/250th of a second, I can't. It's stopping me. And that's because this camera, a Sony a7R V, has a max sync speed of 1/250th of a second. So to go beyond that, I have to turn on high speed sync. So I can turn that on. The strobe supports it, of course, and that lets me go to higher shutter speeds. But there's a real penalty. I'll show you. Before I turned on high-speed sync, adjusting the shutter made the background darker but kept Chelsea the same brightness. With high-speed sync enabled, the brightness of the flash decreases as I increase the shutter speed, which means I'm no longer able to overpower the sun in any meaningful way. I can make the whole image darker, foreground and background, but they can't separate. Here's the difference between true sync and high-speed sync. With true sync, the shutter opens, the flash fires, and then the shutter closes. When you use faster shutter speeds on focal plane cameras, the shutter doesn't expose the entire sensor at once. If you fired a flash, only part of the picture would be exposed. High-speed sync briefly turns your flash into a continuous light. It turns on before the shutter opens and stays lit until the shutter is closed. Because it's behaving like a continuous light, the foreground brightness is also controlled by the shutter speed. I set my flashpoint strobe to the max output. With proper sync, this was the lighting, and with high-speed sync, it was about 2 1/3 stops darker. Your flash is much more powerful when you can avoid using high-speed sync. That's why that sync speed is maybe the most important spec on a camera. But there are some better options. Let me go grab the Hasselblad. This is the Hasselblad X2D 100C, a gorgeous medium format camera. And I'm using the 90mm f2.5 lens. That's about 70mm f2 in 35mm terms. So I'm gonna dial in the equivalent aperture here, which would be f2.5, and take some pictures of Chelsea at different shutter speeds. You can see all the way up to 1/1600th of a second, it synced properly with the flash. That's because it has a leaf shutter. Now here's a weird quirk. The Hasselblad will actually sync up to 1/4000th of a second, but with my wireless trigger here, I think there's just a little bit too much lag for it to work properly, so I found it works better if I actually attach a wire. So I'll do that. Now that's amazing because you can see that it captures the world the way my eyes see it. It's capturing all of that dynamic range. And as a photographer, that's giving me the control I need to produce the images that I want in this location with the f-stop that I want without having to move to a different location or without even having to use a bigger, more expensive light. Here's VoiceOver Tony again to talk about how a leaf shutter differs from the focal plane shutter in the Sony. This is the focal plane shutter in a Sony camera, and because it's right against the sensor, it blocks part of the sensor whenever it's in the process of opening or closing. This is the leaf shutter in a vintage Hasselblad lens, though modern lenses have a very similar leaf shutter. It's moved away from the sensor, and that means when it's opening or closing, it does not block any one part of the sensor. Another thing I want to mention about this amazing Hasselblad, look at the rear screen and how bright it is. When you show your clients the pictures for the first time, it's usually on the back of the camera, and it looks so much better on the Hasselblad's big bright screen than it does on the Sony screen or the screens of Nikon or anybody else. The last camera is the Sony A9 Mark III. This is unique because it has a global shutter, which has an unlimited sync speed up to its maximum shutter speed of 1/80,000th of a second. If you want to pre-order this or order any of the other gear I've shown you, head to this link at Adorama, where you get the best deals, the fastest shipping, great customer support, free stuff with a lot of your purchases, and VIP points, which means money back on your purchase for your next order. I'm going to try this out at every shutter speed, and you'll notice once again I'm using the wired connection because for some reason with the Sony wireless trigger, it sets a maximum sync speed of 1/500th of a second. But if I use an off-brand trigger, then it gives me the true sync that it's capable of. That's incredible, isn't it? I'm able to make photos that look like they were taken at night. The sun looks like the moon when you can shoot it at 1/80,000th of a second, and the sync actually works. Also notice the color of the flash change as I change the shutter speed. That's because the flash duration at that output was about 1/5000th of a second, and at 1/80,000th of a second, it clipped the flash output, changing the color temperature, making her skin tones look blue and kind of ugly. This is the Sony 50mm f1.2 lens, and it gives me gorgeous bokeh. But shooting into the sun with a really fast lens like this is extra hard. I'll show you what I could get at 1/250th. A normal camera's max sync speed. Everything is completely blown out, but I'm not limited to that on the Sony A9 III. I can go really high. Okay, I actually ran into a barrier that I didn't expect. Shooting at f1.2, the A9 Mark III doesn't let me go above 1/16,000th of a second, and that's actually where I really needed the faster shutter speed, so I couldn't completely kill the sun in the background, and in fact, the photo was a little bit overexposed. This camera also has a base ISO of 250, which is worse than the other two cameras. That means that the ambient light is 2 stops brighter than it is on the Hasselblad with its base ISO of 64. And overall, those pull back the advantages of the global shutter a little bit, but still, it is extremely effective, especially in this full frame format where we do have so many gorgeous lenses. I don't know why the Sony's image quality suffered so much at 1/80,000th of a second. It's better at 1/16,000th of a second, but it doesn't have the same light killing ability. The A9 III is an incredibly powerful camera, but right now it's clear for outdoor portraits. The 100 megapixels and leaf shutter make the Hasselblad X2D 100C the best camera in the world for outdoor portraits. After those tests, I decided to bring the cameras back into the studio to do some more controlled testing. In the studio, I decided instead to use the Flashpoint Rapid series of strobes. Flashpoint has a really big variety of mono lights and on-camera flashes that you might use for different situations. And with super high-speed sync, the Rapid line is exactly what I should be using. In speed mode, the minimum flash duration here is just about 1/30,000th of a second. At Harkness, the strobe I was using had a flash sync of about 1/4000th, and I didn't really have a choice about that because I needed a battery-powered pack and I needed a certain flash output. The flash duration increases with the flash output, so the more power you put out, the longer the flash necessarily is, which means if you do want to get the shortest possible flash duration and the best sync with fast shutter speeds, you're probably using small light sources, you're getting very close to the subject, and you're in a controlled environment as opposed to fighting the sun. So how did the cameras perform in the studio environment under the best possible conditions? I did indeed get better syncing out of the A9 III than I did in the real world. As you might expect, when I used a flash duration of 1/30,000th of a second, I did get consistent exposure with the Sony up to 1/30,000th of a second. But when I went above that, the exposure did drop. Now, theoretically, if you had an extremely fast strobe that went faster, you could go all the way to 1/80,000th of a second. But again, you'd be in minimum output in very controlled circumstances. So I don't know that it's really that useful in the real world. Real world for me, I don't think I'd ever use the Sony above 1/16,000th of a second, because even with this incredible fast strobe, I found the color to start to become inconsistent because there's a certain inconsistent delay in the timing between the camera and the flash. At least that's my best guess at why the color started to go crazy. And if you're on a professional shoot, you really need the color to be consistent so that you don't have to spend a bunch of time in post trying to fix things. Even at just 1/16,000th, that's 2 stops faster than the Hasselblad, except that's not how it works out in the real world when you're shooting outside, because the Sony has a base ISO of 250, which is 2 stops faster than the Hasselblad's base ISO of 64. And those offset each other, but then the Hasselblad actually gets an edge because of the medium format sensor. To get the equivalent depth of field, you use a higher f-stop number. All that means is that the Hasselblad at 1/4000th of a second has the same light stopping ability as the Sony does at 1/25,000th of a second. And that's in the range where I started to get inconsistent color. So I think if you are looking for the ultimate light stopping ability, you're still investing in the Hasselblad leaf shutter system. Not to mention we got significantly better image quality out of the Hasselblad than the Sony, thanks to the higher number of megapixels and also the lower base ISO. Now, we've been talking about super expensive gear so far, but there are a lot of inexpensive options that can get you into just practical flash photography, like the Flashpoint Blaze series here. These start at under $100 for a single monolight, and they use the same soft boxes, the same remote wireless triggers as all the gear that we've been using today. Start with a single monolight, a light stand, and a softbox, and you can get a lot of professional portrait work done. That will quickly take your portrait photography beyond the level that photographers can do with their phones. And that's the great thing about Adorama and Flashpoint. They have so many fantastic options. They can grow with you, whether you want $100 model light or whether you're willing to spend thousands in order to sync with the latest cameras. Start at this link here that helps to support us and incredibly intense videos like this that actually took me several weeks of work and testing to make. Adorama makes all that possible. Thank you for sponsoring us, Adorama. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this, and Happy New Year.